Greetings and welcome to this special feature here on News First. I'm Sanitha Senanayaka. Today we are here to discuss the trends of illegal export of cultural artifacts and the local heritage of Sri Lanka. And to do that, we have a very special guest here with us. She is a lecturer in criminology at the School of Social and Political Sciences, a member of the Scottish Centre for Crime and Justice Research, the Trafficking Culture Research Consortium, and the Global Initiative Against Transnational Organised Crime. She is also a fellow at the Centre for Criminology at the University of Hong Kong and an advisor for the Nepal Heritage Recovery Campaign. She has a PhD in criminology at the University of Glasgow and has worked as a lecturer in criminology in the University of Liverpool in Singapore. Now, her research concerns the trafficking and of cultural and natural resources such as antiquities and wildlife. Her research primarily focuses on Asia. She has done her fieldwork in China, Maldives, Thailand, and of course Sri Lanka. She explores how and why participants take part in illicit transnational trades and how urban settings, especially so-called global cities, facilitate such trade. Dr. Emiline Smith, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me.
Doctor, to begin with, just to give a context to our audience, can you explain the ways and means in which cultural artifacts are illegally exported and sold in the world today?
Great question, because we don't know a lot about the practices of illegal trade, but what we do know is that there is a large demand for cultural objects from archaeologically rich countries like Sri Lanka. And there's an entire ecosystem of players like dealers, collectors, auction houses, but also museums that are creating the demand for such cultural objects.
We have heard of about complex and established black markets and underground auctions facilitated by the super rich. How do these fly under the radar of the authorities?
Unfortunately, market countries like North American and European, but also new market countries like China, Japan, and other Asian nations don't have the same strict regulations in place for market players like auctioneers, like dealers, like art collectors that source countries for cultural heritage have. So unfortunately, they carry most of the rewards and less of the risk, whereas most of the risk is carried by those looting and selling the objects in archaeologically rich countries, but they don't get as much of the reward. And that's why we actually don't speak about a black market in antiquities or art. We speak about an entire global gray market, because it's really difficult to identify where the illegal practices are happening, what the illegal act is surrounding a particular object. But what we do know is that most objects that are on the market at some point have had some form of illegality attached to it, whether it is the illegal export, import, trade, or excavation of it.
I see. Now, we know that there is the UNIDROIT Convention and the UNESCO Convention when it comes to protecting artifacts in certain countries. Is there an international, like a body sort of, that enforces these laws when it comes to black markets?
Wouldn't it be nice to have an international police force that focuses only on cultural and natural resources? Unfortunately, no. It's very difficult to hold transnational players accountable because most legislation is very much still border focused, so very much local and national. And of course, there are international agreements like the 1970 UNESCO Convention or like the 1995 UNIDROIT Convention, but they only really work if a lot of people sign up to it. Sri Lanka has accepted these conventions. Well, they've accepted the 1970 UNESCO Convention, but they haven't ratified it, and they certainly haven't ratified the 1995 UNIDROIT Convention. So these bilateral agreements are needed in order to collaboratively counter trafficking, transnational trafficking of cultural objects.
Now, when it comes to Sri Lanka, just last month there was an incident in the Kotavihara Raja Mahavihara where artifacts were stolen. In your expertise, when it comes to Sri Lanka, what is the situation
about theft of cultural objects?
Theft of cultural artifacts.
Sri Lanka has had a long history of theft of cultural objects. Of course, this starts with colonial times. So during colonial period, the Portuguese, the Dutch, and the British, a lot of objects were stolen. What we see, unfortunately, nowadays is that there are less options for alternative sustainable livelihoods, and so to make a quick buck, because there's so much demand for these objects, it is still very interesting to steal these cultural objects.
In your area of expertise, covers illegal export of natural resources. In Sri Lanka, we know biosensitive samples and even rare species of fauna and flora are being trafficked at an alarming rate. How are these trades from Sri Lanka regulated internationally?
There is very strict regulation available for natural resources, perhaps more so than cultural heritage, for example, through CITES. But again, it's where perhaps all local stakeholders are not necessarily working together to effectively implement these tools that we have available. That's where, unfortunately, loopholes start to exist, where, of course, transnational offenders make use of. At the same time, cultural and natural resources share many similarities. They are an emotional topic. People care about their flora and fauna. They care about their cultural heritage. And so that's why it is even more important to protect it, both within Sri Lanka as well as to reduce demand outside of Sri Lanka. Because realistically, it is by reduction of the demand that we actually address this issue globally. It's not, the onus shouldn't be on Sri Lankans.
Let's talk about artifacts back again. What are the main international markets for Sri Lankan illegal exports?
Well, because of its geographical position, you can imagine that most objects are trafficked out of the country through India, but also through Singapore, through Bangkok, which are huge transition portals for such cultural heritage objects. And from there, they appear on international markets. Of course, London, as a former colonizer, the Brits still have a lot of Sri Lankan cultural heritage, and so also still have a lot of demand for such cultural heritage. But actually, because of its Buddhist culture, there is also an increasing demand from China, for example, from Japan, from Vietnam, for Sri Lankan cultural objects.
Now, we know that Sri Lanka was a colony of England, Portugal, and the Dutch. Now, during that time, our artifacts were taken away from this country. Sri Lankan artifacts were taken away, and they're in museums across the world. Is there a mechanism in place in which we can take them back? We can request those countries to give those artifacts back?
Through international collaboration, for example, the 1970 UNESCO Convention or Memoranda of Understanding, bilateral agreements, of course, these objects can be requested back if there is sufficient evidence. Unfortunately, there is a system still in place where the source countries have to prove that these objects were looted. And that creates or at least that continues the exploitation of colonial period into modern day times, right? So instead, we should ask market countries what they are proactively doing in order to address the harms and the wrongs that were done in colonial times, whether through exploitation of their people, through knowledge, and through cultural objects. So it really should be the choice of Sri Lankans on what to do with these objects. And yes, Sri Lanka can make use of certain international agreements for that. It should ratify the 1970 UNESCO Convention and implement that. It should work together with other Asian nations, with its neighbors, as well as with international partners in order to return Sri Lankan heritage, if that is what is desired. But the key thing here is access and agency. That should be restored to Sri Lanka. It should not be in the hands of former colonizers.
Now, Sri Lankan artifacts are not just in museums abroad, they're in private collections as well. How do you propose we request those artifacts be brought back from private collections?
A major effect, or civil society can have a major effect in this case. What we've seen, for example, in Nepal, with the Nepal Heritage Recovery Campaign, is that when civil society starts to care, everyone starts talking about it, when news media starts playing a really big role in this, when there's a public outcry about the harms that are done by keeping these cultural objects abroad instead of with their local communities where they are daily worshipped, where they have intangible heritage attached to them, like for example, festivals, oral traditions, and everything else. If there is a public outcry to return these objects, then for sure that can make a real difference, because not only is there a legal argument for repatriation when there is an illegal export or an illegal import wherever, but there's also an ethical argument. These objects should not be in foreign-held institutions or collections if their source country wants them back, if they actually demand it.
Has there been incidents where national movements were able to bring back artifacts from other countries, like say other countries that they wanted their artifacts back from those colonizers? Has there been a national movement? Has that happened?
Absolutely, yes. So I'm thinking, for example, of the India Pride Project, where a group of volunteers has been able to get a lot of cultural objects repatriated from foreign museums and private collections, where they've basically blasted this all over social media, and they've held them accountable for the harms that are continuously being caused by keeping those objects abroad. Similarly, obviously not ever colonized, but Nepal has had a huge effect. And the Nepal Heritage Recovery Campaign has done fantastic work in this area. And all across Asia, there are movements like this that are kind of popping up, and hopefully in Sri Lanka that will happen soon as well.
Do other countries have laws in place that allow them to, bring back those artifacts from the colonizers? Domestic laws?
Obviously, we're talking about sovereignties. So with these kind of bilateral agreements, we can recognize each other's sovereignties and we can actually work towards repatriation. But the first port of call should really be the public. So critical questions should be asked by anyone that goes to market nations, North America, Europe, anywhere else, to ask questions like, why are these objects here? How did they get here? Do local communities where these objects originated, do they know that it is here? And what can we do in order to bring them back? And of course, we can look at legal instruments. A lot of countries do have facilities to repatriate, but there are a lot of parties involved in the repatriation of cultural objects, right? So perhaps what needs to be a little bit more developed in Sri Lanka is to have a safe return home for these cultural objects, because that is not necessarily in place yet.
So you're saying that this urge to bring back artifacts should stem from the public and not the authorities?
Absolutely, yes. Of course, cultural objects have always been used for political purposes, and yes, cultural heritage can definitely shape a nation. It can be a source of individual and national pride. It can lead to social cohesion. It can really unite the people, but it should really come from the bottom up and not from the top down. This shouldn't be a national political narrative, for example.
We talked about how Sri Lanka should bring back artifacts from abroad. Now, do you think Sri Lanka is doing enough to preserve and protect the artifacts that are already here in Sri Lanka?
I think that a lot of the instruments are already in place in Sri Lanka, but for sure more enforcement and more efficiency in enforcement, of course that can be strengthened. So for example, in Sri Lanka's case, more transparency is needed, more accountability between stakeholders that are working in this area, and also more communication. What I found in countries all across Asia, but especially in Sri Lanka, is that a lot of these stakeholders don't really communicate with each other. They sit on a lot of data, they have a lot of really helpful practices that they're implementing, but because they're not streamlining these efforts, it's not as effective as could be.
When it comes to illegal exports and sale of artifacts now, is there any way we can get support from the international community, say any criminal investigations agencies like the Interpol?
Interpol has a very helpful database in place, the Stolen Art database. Sri Lanka has unfortunately not made use of that yet, but that could be a helpful way of at least discovering cultural heritage abroad.
If we request data from that database, would they give us?
Yes, and also especially customs and law enforcement, can upload data on thefts and on instances of looting and illegal import and export. So there are definitely instruments in place that Sri Lanka can make more use of. But ultimately, once it leaves the borders of Sri Lanka, it is very difficult to return objects. So it is, of course, better to protect them here than it is to get them back, because getting them back, proving that they were originating from Sri Lanka, proving that they were removed illegally, is incredibly difficult.
Now, when it comes to bringing these artifacts back and protecting the ones that are already here, where are we going wrong? What have we done wrong?
Well, as I say, I think that a lot of agencies, governmental institutions, museums, academics, and other stakeholders can communicate with each other a little bit more. There is not enough transparency and accountability, and more than ever also, I think that this could really be something that Sri Lankan society can get involved in, because ultimately this is Sri Lanka's history. This should be for the people, so it shouldn't be, for example, me telling you to protect Sri Lanka's cultural heritage. If that isn't something that is desired at the moment, then of course we shouldn't do it. But if this is something that local communities would want and need, then government institutions as well as others should support the protection of cultural objects in whatever way necessary.
We talked about illegal export and sale of artifacts. What are the other commodities that are being exported illegally like this that the public is not aware of?
Well, a lot of cultural and natural resources are being traded illegally, and they are being demanded by the collector who is looking for rare, exotic, oriental, fetishized objects, from seashells to tiger skins to petrified Himalayan caterpillars. There is a market for everything. There's a market for books made of pirate skin, for example. And of course now with online trade, we see a lot more of that illicit trade pop up. And there's more of a global reach for these kinds of illicit trades. So in that sense, it's becoming perhaps a little bit more like it's more of a global scale.
Recently, Facebook took down an online auction marketplace where they were selling illegal commodities like this. What can international companies do similar to this to prevent this from happening?
It's incredibly difficult, of course, but much like them having the instruments to facilitate trade on their marketplaces, they should also be able to curb illicit trade, right? Illicit trade is as old as the marketplace itself. But realistically, when we talk about the 21st century, we should all be making an effort to curb illicit trade in cultural objects. So larger companies, online auction sites, for example, should be monitoring whatever happens on their platforms. Always, of course.
Sri Lanka has had a history of 2,500 years. What is your recommendations to improve the local mechanism to protect our artifacts?
I'm really hoping that civil society can play a bigger role in this, in holding government accountable for their role in this, and to demand a change in how protection is effectuated here in Sri Lanka. And that can be as small as asking those critical questions in your local museum, or talking to your neighbors about it, or thinking of a specific cultural objects that you would love to see repatriated from a museum abroad. But also it can be on a larger scale. I think that the government, for example, when they have improved communication between its branches, I think that the government can play a bigger supportive role in this.
Now, you're from the Netherlands. As a country that has colonized other countries in the past, how do people in those countries feel about giving back the artifacts that were taken from the colonies?
I can't speak for the whole of the Netherlands, but I think that there's a lot more public awareness in these countries about the past wrongs and a desire to make things right. But again, what needs to be stepped up is proactive engagement with these problematic narratives. A lot more can be done, in former colonizing nations and market countries in order to address the problematic narratives that are attached to these cultural objects, in order to really effectuate social justice. That means reinstating access, agency, and power over these objects, and also over the knowledges that they create, have created, and perhaps will create in the future, as well as, for example, visual imagery and the intellectual property attached to these objects. So if that isn't reinstated to its country of origin when that is demanded or desired, then how can we ever achieve social justice?
Here in Sri Lanka, some people would say that we have bigger problems than trying to repatriate the artifacts back, because we have economical problems and all of that. What do you have to say about that?
Absolutely. I think Sri Lanka is definitely struggling, and it's difficult when there are lives at stake to imagine how cultural heritage should become a priority. I'm not suggesting that it should be, but cultural heritage can also be a source of pride, individual pride, community pride, national pride. It can really connect people to each other. And so in that, it can be a source of strength. It can be a source of rebuilding. And I'm hoping that Sri Lanka can use its cultural heritage, whether held here or abroad, in order to rebuild the fantastic nation that it is.
You are someone who has worked with international organizations in bringing back artifacts to colonies, countries that were once colonies. What can they do to speed up this process?
The source countries or the market
countries?
countries?
No, the international organizations that you've worked with.
They can do so much more than just provenance research. I think reactive provenance research is important for sure. If there is, for example, a demand case for them to do provenance research is important, but more importantly, they should proactively look at ways to collaborate with the countries of origin in order to find new ways of repatriation of knowledge and cultural objects. It's not just about holding power over these objects. It's also about creating new collaborations and creating new identities and knowledges. And museums and other institutions, as well as foreign governments, have benefited so long from the natural and cultural resources of their colonies that really now it is time to give back in whatever way necessary. And of course, that's a painful topic to breach, but it is the only right way to address these past wrongs.
Dr. Emiline, thank you very much for joining us on the program. We are glad that you're here in Sri Lanka and you're
Pleasure.
creating awareness when it comes to this topic. Thank you.
Thank you.
And that's a wrap of all of us here at News First. We will join you again soon. Until then, goodbye.